This is a video dealing with the poem Poppies by Jane Weir. Now, Poppies is a slightly different poem in some ways. It was apparently commissioned as a poem to deal with the idea of people left behind, of mothers, and the impact on people who lose people at war. But I think reading through it seems almost as much bothered with the relationship between a mother and a son, and the way a mother loses her son as he grows up, as it does with anything to do with war. Certainly the interpretation is there. Now, as we begin to look at it, there's a few cultural things it just helps us to know. You may be aware of them. The first of all is the symbolic significance of poppies that, of course, are worn on Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, and in the lead up to it. Supposedly remembering those who were lost in wars, but also the hope for future peace. That was the intention, and that's happened ever since the First World War. Later on, we have the image of a single dove, and doves are generally considered to be a symbol for peace or freedom or love. And in the same line, we have pears and pear trees. Well, we have a pear tree. Now, that may be something you're less aware of. And they certainly have been seen as symbolic of many things, including love and immortality. So if you take a symbolic interpretation, it could refer to those. But of course, it could be anything. And finally, the wishbone, a part of a chicken. There's a tradition that it's pulled between two people, and whoever gets the longest piece when it breaks can make a wish. And obviously comes in the later image right at the end. So let's go through what happens. First of all, it opens 3 days before Armistice Sunday. It appears that is then allowing us to go back to a memory of the narrator placing a poppy on her son's blazer. It's not made clear the distance between them. She recounts a memory of smartening him up and points out that she also at the same time resisted the temptation to treat him like she did when he was a child. Then she goes to the moment when he leaves the house. All of this apparently one memory in sequences, apparently to go to war. He felt excited. She went to his room after he left. It's then very ambiguous as to whether he dies. Now, it would appear that he has, because of the line of the single dove flying from the pear tree, which doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense if it's not some kind of reference to his soul. But it's never made absolutely clear that that's what happens. So be aware of the ambiguity. It could literally just be that he has gone to war. And then she goes to the war memorial, wishing she could hear his voice as a child again. We apparently go back to the 3 days before Armistice Sunday idea. And this shows the significance of the memory, or places the memory certainly in some kind of frame. Okay, so the title. Go back to that significance. It therefore evokes not just war or those who die at war, but also the hope of peace, potentially. Now, of course, that could be to do with a general idea of peace. Let's hope that we don't get war, we get peace. But it could also be a sense of the peace that the mother wishes. So you can see it in all kinds of ways here. I think the main thing is it's about setting the mood early on. Okay, let's begin looking at the first stanza. We've got 4 stanzas here. They are irregular in length. They just deal with different aspects here. This one deals with the opening 3 days before Armistice Day that sets it very clearly in place. And then the beginning of the memory, which goes to the link of the poppy. Okay, as though that is what sparked off the memory. Now, when she's talking about pinning the poppy on the blazer, some of this imagery here, the spasms of paper red particularly, is not something that makes the poppy seem like any kind of comforting symbol to her. Now remember, this is her remembering pinning one onto his lapel before he left, and the suggestion that there is spasms of paper red may be seen as foreshadowing potentially. And then when you throw in the idea that the poppy disrupts the yellow bias, which seems to go around the edge of the blazer, calling that a blockade of yellow bias would then suggest that it's disrupting that blockade. Is that disrupting the protection that the yellow bias affords? As though what was protecting him will be any longer. It's the edge of a blazer, so I'm not entirely sure. I think the key idea here is to remember that this is her looking back on this. So it could well be that she is imposing memory or meaning, on memory. And that may well be a central idea behind this poem. The way that people, in hindsight, impose their own interpretations of meaning. There's also a suggestion there that it's red disrupting yellow. And of course you've got the red, yellow, green idea of the traffic lights. The potential warning is then disrupted by, a definite warning, possibly. However, before he left, this does appear to be him dressed up very, very smartly. It doesn't really seem he's dressed up immediately to go to war. I assume it's just sending him off looking his best at the beginning of his journey. And maybe there's a sense there as well that journey isn't what it appears to be at the beginning. Now, this hard plosive alliteration of the B further brings in this sense of hindsight. Yeah? It's a reflection, or could be seen certainly, to reflect her mood. If she is spitting out the B's, the blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer, it could suggest feelings of frustration, of anger, whatever. So it comes back to that idea of maybe her projecting her feelings and possibly in hindsight afterwards. Now, stanza 2 takes us further, starting apparently with this idea of her smartening him up, using this very homemade tool of sellotape around her hand, done backwards so she can get the cat hairs off it, smoothing down his upturned collar, a very, very mother thing to do. But I think the detail takes us more around in this point, the idea that she uses something like sibilance here, smoothing down your shirt's upturned collar, steel softening of my face. Now, it's not overdone, and it's a very gentle S at this point. And the fact that she talks about the softening of her face seems to me to link the two things up. Now, the softening of her face, I always would read as a sense of being about to cry, ready to weep, and the sadness and emotion overtaking her. But the point she's making is that she steals that softening, that she puts on a facade over the front of it, steel over softening. Yet, if I'm right, or you take my interpretation anyway, this sibilance almost suggests that the softening is overpowering the steeling. So maybe the emphasis is on the fact that the vulnerability almost can't be hidden. When she steals the softening of her face, it's there. And that works particularly in terms of the reflection that she then goes back into. She stays in the moment, but uses it to want to refer to things when they were children. He was a child, sorry. Returning to how she used to treat him as a child. Now, it's very important to notice she doesn't go back to a further memory. It's what she wants to do right then. So he's an adult, leaving, apparently going off to war. But she wants, at that moment, to do the kind of childish things that they used to do. The Eskimo kiss, rubbing their noses together, running her fingers through his gelled hair. Now, this obviously again suggests a sense of vulnerability, a sense of that sense of softening, the emotion, the kind of sense of nostalgia coming through to her. But I think it's just as interesting to consider the effect it's having on her. It's the fact that she wants to play. It's the fact that she wants to just gently show affection through running her fingers through his hair. And that's described as an impulse. And so we get a sense here, even though it's wanted to begin with, it's now an impulse to do this. This seems beyond just something she's interested in, something that, she kind of wants to go back to a particular situation. It's almost like something she can't control. We're almost looking at the motherly instinct. And then to detach slowly melting into the beginning of the third stanza brings us back further, again, the vulnerability as her words slowly melt. And I think the interesting image there is to suggest that the words are slowly melting does make it seem like it's a natural process that she can do nothing to stop. So we move into the moment of leaving in stanza 3 as the memory continues. Now, again, especially as it's going to be important here, it's very important to remember this is her memory, so all of it's her perspective. Therefore, even though we get this sense of the confidence and enthusiasm of him in direct contrast to her vulnerability, and I think having slowly melting at the beginning of this stanza right next to it with I was brave as well, even further emphasises the difference in the way the two of them see this situation. But I just said, remember, it's her perspective. So she's the one thinking the world is overflowing like a treasure chest for him. She's the one thinking he was intoxicated as he went away. This is not us getting inside his head. And therefore, when we look at the images that she chooses, they reflect her more than him, and her view more than him. So if we look at the idea of the world overflowing like a treasure chest, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, really. And maybe it's meant to be that way, to suggest its lack of realism. But is she just using it to suggest that's how it seems to a young person? Or do we connect it to the situation a little bit more? He's going to join the army. Is that really taking the most of the world that's overflowing like a treasure chest? That's a possible thing there. Is there a sense that if when you're young and the door's thrown open, the world's overflowing like a treasure chest, is there a sense of regret in her own life that she's led to this moment? There's a number of ways you could interpret that. But I would always say, take the idea of what the simile means and reflect that it's her opinion, her reading of the situation. Remember, she throws the door open, which in her memory suggests that she's almost enthusiastically allowing him to go, despite the way she feels. It's her bravery. And then, of course, it's added in that he leaves intoxicated. Of course, intoxicated brings to mind, influenced by something else, and particularly generally alcohol. Yet the idea that he goes away intoxicated, well, drunk suggests not in control of himself, doesn't it? It suggests that he is drunk on something, the excitement of going away or whatever, so he's not seeing things realistically. So although she's being brave, are her words undercutting the reality of how she's seeing it? Well, the next few lines really then become significant. She goes into her bedroom and releases a songbird from its cage. It's a very strange image. Obviously, she doesn't literally, after he goes, go up to his bedroom, open a cage and let a songbird out the window. So the metaphor must link to the idea of letting him go. I mean, whether she goes upstairs and starts singing, I don't know in reality. But what I would take from it is the sense of releasing a songbird from the cage. Again, almost a cliche thing. Why would you cage up a songbird? For your selfish purposes. A songbird, all it does is sing. So if you cage it up, it's so that you can have its song alone. And of course, birds being released suggests a sign of freedom. So there could well be a sense of her recognition of the selfishness of her feelings at this point, and saying that once she's let him go, she realises that's what she's got to do. But it's immediately juxtaposed with the image of the single dove flying from the pear tree, which leads her to the churchyard. Now, there are different ways of reading this, of course, but the representations that we suggest about the dove and the fact it's a single dove and any images to do with the pear tree lead us to a suggestion that she hears about his death. It's not clear, and it's deliberately not clear, but it does suggest that that's why 3 days before Armistice Day she's going to the churchyard to where all the poppies are out. If so, it is quite a peaceful image, as though the release of his soul is gentle and almost natural in some ways. But by contrasting it through the juxtaposition with the songbird that she released, does it actually lead us to consider, was he safer caged in the first place? If he wasn't released, he'd be there safe. He might be caged up. Maybe there's something we can read in terms of freedom, but I would more go to the idea of the mother's dilemma, of feeling that she still needs to protect him, even when she has to let him go free. Then goes to the churchyard. She describes herself as skirting, which I think is an interesting one here, suggesting she's going around the edges. Fear, at the very least, possibly a sense of avoidance. And it takes us over into the final stanza. It's interesting to know she reaches the top of the hill. That could always be seen symbolically and tracing all the inscriptions on the war memorial. I don't think he's going to find his name on it because that would be a bit too quick. And it will be a linking of him to the tradition of the people who had gone to war and lost their lives. And again, maybe the pointless futility. But when she gets to the war memorial, she does lean against it like a wishbone. Now, you might take the leaning significantly, as I suggest there, the fact that she is almost looking to it for support, maybe the memory of others, things like that in the past supporting her, something like this. But really, most likely, you're going to take the simile here, the wishbone. Now, obviously, first of all, it suggests that it's like she's making a wish. Okay? It's got that image of the shape of the wishbone, the memorial, and then her going up to a point together. And there's lots of ways you could think. Remember, when you pull a wishbone, it's whoever gets the longer piece. And that's supposed to, it depends what you think of with that shape. The war memorial's obviously probably slightly bigger than her, but is her head the top of the wishbone? So when it parts, does she get the wish? You could take that any way you like. I prefer to consider the whole point of pulling a wishbone. It's a load of nonsense. It's superstition. We all know it's not going to really do anything. And maybe that's the point. She's grabbing hold of anything, even though she knows it's pointless. So the dove then pulls freely against the sky, and she carries on this imagery she uses all the way through of clothing, which, make of it what you will. Focusing, I think, more on the final line here. This idea of her desire to hear his playground voice catching the wind. Because it means that right at the end of the poem, she goes back to this sense of wanting to see him as a child again. And in this case, wanting him to become a child again. Now, that's obviously a possibility within the idea of war, of suggesting, safety. And it could go with that sense that we've just been discussing about the caged bird and all that idea, the word of flying like a treasure chest, all that intoxicated. The sense of a desire for him to be safe. A child playing in the playground rather than playing at war, say. And of course, boys tend to play at war in the playground. But to me, I think it's probably more the idea that it goes to that mother-son thing again. And the suggestion that I put across here is that the loss, the grief that she's experiencing this poem seems to be as much grief for the loss of her son as a child, for the loss of that moment when she was a mother to him, when she was the important person, when she could protect him, could look after him. As much as it's about grief overall, I think there's a sense of how mothers grieve for the loss of their son as a young son. Now, if we take this further into the form and layout, we go back to this idea of the narrative voice. I've mentioned already the fact that means we have to see that everything is her perspective, even when it appears not to be. Now, the son appears to be dead, as we've said before, so the focus is clearly on that relationship. But the thing I would add in is, as she's talking directly to him, think how intrusive that makes us. It's an increasingly intimate thing, and we're sat there listening to it, to something we have no purpose really being a part of. And this is something Weir appears to do, force us into this intimate situation to make us confront the horror of what's happened. Now, it's also specifically placed as 3 days before Armistice Sunday, Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, or the Sunday nearest to the 11th of November. And I think that specific time placement then does allow us to take all of those issues we've been discussing and place them in the context of this being a long, well, I wouldn't say tradition, because I suggest it's done deliberately, but a long time period, I suppose, of lost soldiers and of mothers having to deal with the grief of lost soldiers in general. And therefore taking the single specific moment and, like something like Remains, for example, making us consider it in a much broader context. But then we do have to come back to the choice of finality, the choice of the final line, which comes to that point I was just discussing with you, that the focus may be as much on the loss of a child to an adult, to its mother, as on the loss to war. So let's look at just a couple of these big ideas then. First of all, the impact of war. There's a few things I've suggested here. Obviously, this idea that it's somebody outside the first-hand experience. We do get that elsewhere with war photographer, but then again, I suppose they are in the first-hand experience. They're not a soldier, but they're there. So this really is probably the only one, unless you think of Tennyson, who is trying to take us into the actual experience but has no experience of it himself, where we're really considering how war impacts society as a whole, because we're looking at the people left behind. And then, as we just suggested, the intimacy of that situation can take us beyond those bigger issues, leads us sometimes into the emotional response of the mother. However, ultimately, I think whatever other ideas we see, it is dealing with the grief of somebody who is lost too early. Yeah, remember, that idea of a mother losing her child is an unnatural situation. It's not expected to happen. The older generation is expected to go before the younger, and that, as much as anything else, may be the impact that we're looking at here. We've also got, though, a memory dominating well over half of this poem. Now, it does, as I suggest there, deal with a specific memory of the moment, but it does morph into a larger picture then, that the moment seems to represent her loss of the moment when a child needs its mother, as that's what she focuses on at that time. And therefore his walking out of the door could just as easily represent his walking out of that situation. And that fits particularly well if you are not convinced he's dead. However, we have got the use of the Armistice Day setting, which takes a further idea of the overall power of memory. Because it relates to a kind of like a long line of mothers losing their sons. It reminds us that the memories continue, they outlast a person. Maybe her tracing the names on the war memorial reminds us that each one of those had a similar situation. So the way that the memory affects the mother does attach to that idea of how much power memories have. But it also reminds us that that's not necessarily a good thing, that maybe sometimes memories can overwhelm and destroy lives from their carrying on.